Howdy students, I hope that you enjoyed The Miller's Tale. I know it's a different kind of tale, even Chaucer warns you about it a little bit. Anyway, it's an interesting tale. Anyway, the miller tells the tale right after the night, as we know, and of course the host is actually asking the monk to tell a tale, which sort of kind of falls in with the way medieval class systems worked, so it makes sense that the monk might tell a tale after the knight, being one of the more important people along on the pilgrimage. But the miller breaks in, and the miller breaking in to tell his tale in the way that he does tells you a lot about, in some ways, about the kind of tale he's going to tell. First of all, he's drunk, but also it tells you about what the tale itself is meant to do, because when the miller breaks in, what he's doing is he's kind of upsetting the social order. He's literally turning things on its head. He's subverting, to some extent, what should be kind of the correct order of telltellers. And that's exactly what his story does too. He tells a fablio, and that's a French word for fable, but it's not a fable. Fable is more commonly a story with a lesson about animals, but this is a fablio, which is in some ways a subversion of a fable in its way, because the lessons that fablio teach, and they do often teach lessons, is, well, they're dark lessons in the sense of they use humor and usually obscene scenes and that sort of thing to point to those sorts of lessons, like, don't get drunk in this way, it could get you into trouble. Don't get fooled. Don't let people take advantage of you. They're more those kinds of stories. And some of them can be a lot of fun. They can be a lot of fun, but they're darker in a sense. Anyway, but one of the things we notice about the Miller's Tale is that it has a very similar plot in some instances. Obviously, it's not got a whole lot of chivalry going on or anything, but it has a very similar plot to the Knights. What do I mean by that? Well, it has a love triangle. You have two people in love with the same woman. Now, the woman happens to be married, but you have two men in love with the same woman, and one of them gets her, and they do, to an extent, battle over her. Though, again, it's one of those things where in that battle, one of them wins. And I think maybe one of the reasons why it is so similar to the Knights is because the miller is trying to say, hey, look, Knight, you told this great, correct, perfect, aristocratic story with all of the right virtues and that sort of thing in it, but that's not the way real life is. I'm a miller, I'm a regular person, I'm in the peasant class, and that's not how we live. Life isn't really that way for most of us. In fact, life can be very hard, and we just have to kind of take the things that we get and do the best we can with them, because, we don't have the advantages that you all have, and we have to cope with things as they are. And so to some extent, that's kind of what the story is saying about the Knight's Tale, saying it's not realistic. That's a fantasy world. Yeah, sure, we'd all like to live there, but that's not where we really live. The world we live in is more like the one in the Miller's Tale. At least that's what the miller thinks, and that's what he's trying to tell not only the knight, but the other telltellers. This is the way the real world is. And in that real world, we have a young, beautiful girl. In fact, she's described in a way more so in greater detail than is Emily. But Emily is described kind of in this idealized way. The way that that Allison in the Miller's Tale is described, you'll notice he focuses, the miller as a narrator focuses a lot on her physical features, and he particularly focuses around the girdle area and the neck and chest area. His interest in her from the beginning, everyone's interest in her, is not so much about her perfect, ideal, chivalric beauty. The interest in her from the very beginning is sexual, that she is a sexual object. She's there to be looked at. Her husband is too old to meet her needs, or so to speak. That's what the story is trying to suggest to us, that such an old husband shouldn't be married to such a young girl, because it's a shame, it's a waste of such a beautiful girl who should be with a younger man who can take care of her, so to speak. And that's kind of what the story is saying about that kind of relationship, what's called a May-January relationship. And so she's described that way. And another thing you should notice about her is she has dark hair. Emily has light gold hair. In almost all romances, the women have golden hair. They have beautiful, light, pale hair. That's what's beautiful. And women who have dark hair tend to be portrayed in this sort of fashion. They tend to be considered more lusty, that sort of thing. And so you have those opening scenes. You have the Miller breaking in. He's drunk, and then he starts telling his tale. And one of the very first things he does is spend a multitude of lines describing Allison and telling us that she's married to a husband that's too old for her. And then we have Nicholas, who is of the love triangle, the winner in a way. We'll talk about how the ways he's not a winner in a minute, but he's a clerk. What's a clerk? Well, it's a student. They're studying to go either usually into the church or into law, in fact, medieval equivalent of a lawyer. So he's studying at a university. And that study would have included a lot of your traditional classical Roman, the four main areas of study, I think, like rhetoric, which would be like, English literature today or something like that, and speech. And you had mathematics and geometry. And there's one more that's escaping my mind right now. Let's see, mathematics, geometry, rhetoric. I'll look it up and put it on there. Anyway, these are kind of the areas they studied, and he has to learn for law. And so he's a student that's living with Nicholas. It's kind of like a student living with a married couple and paying rent to have a room in their house. And that's exactly what we see here. That's the situation. And anyway, but he's a younger man who evidently is more willing to help Allison out with a younger woman's needs than her husband can help her with. And he's really, really forward. If you all saw that word quaint, when he grabs her by that means he's grabbing her by her private parts. I mean, it's inappropriate, absolutely. And she kind of goes, tee, most women wouldn't actually behave that way, but you remember, this is the Miller's fantasy, so he can kind of have it the way he wants it. And he, so she kind of she reprimands him sort of, but only sort of, in the sense that they concoct this lovely elaborate plan to fool her husband. And, that plan involves all this stuff about the flood coming again, and stuff a person shouldn't believe unless they're stupid, which is what the Miller's trying to say. Is trying to say the older husband is stupid. Remember, this is not the Knight's Tale. This is not the correct, everyone is in the superlative sense. It's the opposite. Everyone is stupid, out to get something, whatever helps. They're fairly selfish for the most part. And in fact, even more than making fun of the Knight's Tale can be seen in the figure of Absalom, because Absalom, he's a clerk too, but he acts like a courtier. In fact, in some ways, he should remind us of the prioress. And he's trying to act in kind of a more aristocratic way. And he's made quite a great deal of fun of, and he doesn't get Allison's attention. The Miller is trying to say, that's not what gets a woman's attention. Just coming straight up to her and expressing your sexual interest is what will get her attention. None of this these love words and silver-tongued chivalry. No, that doesn't get a woman's attention. That's what the Miller is saying with this tale. He say, just be upfront with her, take what you want. And so they concoct their elaborate scheme, and it does work, and it fools him. And then, of course, what's really funny, as dirty as the story is, as dirty as the encounter with her the first time, in the first few lines, when he just grabs her straight up and expresses his interest, and then later with the whole hot poker scene where things get quite a bit more dirty again. For all of that, the actual love scene between Allison and Nicholas is rather obscure, a little bit euphemistic, and, not as much detail. And it's kind of happy bird singing sort of thing. So it's kind of funny that in a tale that's darker in other ways and has some violence and is certainly up front at the beginning, the Miller does still portray the sexual act itself as a rather pleasant sort of happy, it's not a dark thing. anyway. And what's darker is later, the the really bad part where we have people getting branded on the butt and kissing places we don't want to talk about. That's darker, and that's where we have kind of the whole love triangle conflict moment. And I'm sorry, I'm really tired, so I'm trying to remember my notes that I made. And that's the darker part. But this is all just trying to point back to, like I was saying, where it's about subversion, and it's about kind of one-upping the knight, because that's definitely one of the main things that the miller is trying to do. And the miller is also saying, because remember, at the end of the day, all these stories are told as part of a tale-telling contest, and the miller at the end of the day is trying to say a funny story about real life people, or at least people that I think are closer to real life people, is a better story than an idealistic fantasy world where people don't really live like that and everything is supposedly perfect, because most people don't live like that and haven't ever. And that's not a good story. And whereas the Knights tells the correct, really rhetorical, educated story. And so you're going to see a lot of that, kind of this jumping around from different types of stories, because they're trying to say something about stories themselves and the way one should tell a story. What's a better story? And as far as language goes, one of the things I would like you to do is, because we've talked about language a little, and I'm going to get a little more specific starting next week. I'm kind of letting you guys get into the tales, but one of the things I would like you to do is flip back and forth between the knight's tale and the miller's tale. And I want you to see how many multisyllabic words the knight's tale has, and how many 1- and 2-syllable words the miller's tale has. Because even the language, Chaucer is a very careful craftsman. Even the language reflects what's supposed to be their social station, and the type of story it is. That one is rhetorical, and one is not. It's cruder and simpler, and so the language is also that way. The language is cruder. That Q word has become a really bad word in our language, and it was that bad at the time. It was just as bad as bad as it is today. It was bad at the time too. It was very upfront, and it was obscene. And it's really important to pay attention to the language, because it tells you so much about the miller. And he's not actually all that well liked by the pilgrims. They think he's crude. They don't like him. And one of the things, though, I want you to notice is when the narrator breaks in right before the miller tells his story, when he breaks in there, I want you to notice that is what I'm going to call a narrative moment, in the sense that we don't just have a smooth story from front to beginning with these pilgrims interacting and telling their stories. We have the narrator break in and give his opinion at times. And that is to remind us, like we talked about narrative frames last time, that is to remind us that it is in fact narrated, that one person wrote all of it down, that it's, as much as you can get lost in a story sometimes and get caught up in the plot, the narrator repeatedly in these kind of tag bits at the front and the end of stories that actually tell you about the telling contest, the narrator repeatedly breaks in and gives his comment on things, and it's supposed to influence what we think. And and what's really interesting is, as much as this is supposed to be a story of a bunch of people riding along on a pilgrimage, it's also supposed to be read as a story in a book. And how do we know that? Because he says, turn the page. He's referring specifically to it in book form. And that's just really interesting. It's what's also called meta-narrative, when the narrative itself refers to the fact that it's being narrated. And that's meta-narrative. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, for all that it is a little crude. It does say a lot about medieval culture, and it does say a lot about the difference in the classes and what one class thought of the other class. And tells you something about human nature too, and the way we get into competitions. And sometimes when we come from different places, we have a hard time understanding where another person is coming from. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to hearing you guys' responses on the discussion board and all that stuff this week. So, signing off, and we'll see you next week.